Is the Mormon Church a corporation? Well, it's legally organized as a corporation, but does that make it not a church? This is something that bothers a lot of disillusioned members of the church and ex-Mormons, that the LDS Church has a lot of money, and it seems to be pretty good at business. It has a lot of people who conduct business on its behalf. It has a giant investment fund that some people estimate holding as much as $200 billion or more in investments. They have real estate around the world. Scholars have written on this. There's a group of volunteers called the Widow's Mite Project who do their best to try to figure out what's going on with all of the financial dealings of the LDS Church. Does it operate on the level? It seems to be kind of secretive about its finances. It's not incredibly transparent with its own members about its finances, and yet it seems to be doing really well financially. I think it's fair to say that the LDS Church is a very business-oriented church. Now, as I said, that bothers a lot of people, but you get pushback from members of the LDS Church who say, I'm really glad that my church is good at handling money and they're not going broke or about to go broke. The problem comes in when people try to apply the standards of Jesus' sayings and actions in the New Testament to the standard that the LDS Church seems to uphold or transact as it does its stuff in the world, as it goes about its dealings in the world. Well, so how do I feel about it? I'm a little bit ambivalent, honestly, because I like the idea that a Christian church would follow the advice of Jesus, and that if it has a lot of wealth, that it's going to use that wealth to help the poor. Because that seems to me to be consistent with a lot of Christ's sayings and actions in the New Testament. I don't really imagine Jesus hoarding wealth. But having said that, I'm just sharing with you my own personal view, and I'm certainly not here to tell the LDS Church how to do its business. That's not my role. I am someone who's geeking out about Mormonism, so the question about the church's wealth and what it does with it is something definitely to geek out about. But as I said, those things that I might be bothered about, and a lot of other disillusioned Mormons or ex-Mormons might be bothered about, are countered by people in the church who think that the church's actions are generally reasonable and just, because the LDS Church does help a lot of people in the world. LDS people give a lot of service in the world. They're often on hand during catastrophes. When I was an active LDS person, I helped out in hurricane relief efforts, for example. I used to engage in work on a welfare farm as a volunteer, a farm that made food to feed the poor, the less fortunate. So I know the church is engaged in all kinds of charitable activities. But the question is, when you have so much wealth, couldn't you help more? couldn't you do more? And so people get, they get bothered by that. And there's also a way in which the business acumen of the church, its desire to be frugal with its money, and also its concern about legal entanglements, does seem to force it or push it in the direction of being, somewhat unfeeling or more concerned about its own financial interests than it is with its spiritual business. Now, this is going to be very controversial and something that people disagree about. But I can say, as a person who grew up in the LDS Church in the 1970s and 1980s, those were the years of my childhood and teen years, the church has really changed a lot. It used to have, in my mind, a more vibrant community life with a lot more activities that were casual, that were held at people's homes, a lot of potluck dinners, haunted houses, dramas that were put on. They called them road shows. And that was, so the church had this incredibly vibrant life of activities for its members. But over time, all of that stuff has kind of faded away, and the church seems more narrowly focused on just doing the bare bones, basic services for its members. And that, I think that's kind of compromised the sense of community. So it's weird how these, I don't know, seemingly unrelated issues come together to make the church seem less like a community of people at times than a business, which is what leads people to talk about TSCC, the so-called church, and to talk about the corporation instead of the church, because they're just not seeing the human love there, I guess. Another one of the real hot button issues in the 2000s earlier was the LDS Church constructed this huge multi-billion-dollar shopping mall in downtown Salt Lake City called City Creek, the City Creek Mall project. And, you know, it really was kind of wild at the time. It was big news. Here, this church, the LDS Church, was building a giant shopping mall. There's this passage in the Book of Mormon about a huge building that's filled with prideful people who scorn the righteous, the humble, and the poor. That's called the Great and Spacious Building. And you know, it just kind of seemed, if you were an LDS person on the sidelines watching the church build this multi-billion-dollar building in Salt Lake City, that they were constructing their own great and spacious building for the wealthy people to go and shop in this fancy environment. And it really is, it's an upscale mall. It costs billions of dollars, and it didn't really have a religious purpose. So the people who supported it would say, well, you know, that's not really fair because the church is trying to revitalize the downtown Salt Lake City area, which the church has a big interest in because they've got, you know, their temple, their headquarters, you know, church library, museum, visitor center, all this stuff down there, downtown Salt Lake City. And they want it to be a nice place, just like, you know, the Catholic Church wants Vatican City to be a nice place. So, you know, what are you ex-Mormons, disillusioned Mormons bellyaching about? Be grown-ups and just accept that the church has to do business and has to look out for the welfare of its, you know, downtown image and the city that it's headquartered in. I get that. Right. Something I watched recently really got me thinking along these lines and put this issue right in front of my eyes again, where I could think about it, and gave me quite a different perspective. And that's Coffee for a Dream, this YouTube channel that I've promoted before, where this woman, Barbara, who's a recent convert, is talking about how she came to the church and how it's really made her life better. And she interestingly, and I don't really understand why, I don't understand how, as such a new member, this has come to her attention. I don't know, maybe people are still really upset about it and talking about it in Mormon circles or in online discussions, but she addresses the issue of the Mormon Church being called a corporation instead of a church, and she provides a very interesting perspective on it as someone who comes out of a business background, who worked in advertising, marketing, worked for various companies, and she responds to this issue of the church behaving like a corporation quite differently. It was kind of refreshing and unexpected because it, of course, isn't a complaint about the church being that way, but it's also not the usual apologetic that you get when people defend the church when it's being characterized as a corporation. Barbara's viewpoint is, I've worked in many corporations, and I'm really happy that this one works so much better than the other ones I've worked in. She doesn't work for the church, by the way, to my knowledge, but she comes from that business world, and she actually finds it faith-affirming that the LDS Church runs so well, that it does things so well. And I was kind of taken aback by that. And that's probably because as a lifelong Mormon, now someone who doesn't affiliate with the LDS Church anymore, but feels very warmly toward it, I just didn't expect that someone would feel that way, because for me it's been that narrative of change from the more homey church with a lively community. My branch growing up, I grew up in a small rural branch. It's not a full-size ward. It didn't meet in an actual LDS chapel. It met in an elementary school, in fact, that was rented for that purpose. And only right before I left on my mission, like a few years or maybe a couple of years before I left on my mission, did my branch become a ward that met in an actual ward house. So my view on it is, I've seen the church go from something that just seemed a lot more homey, personal, that was all about the branch and the ward and its activities, where you're meeting at people's houses and having all kinds of different activities all the time, the dances, the road shows, all of that, to something that was increasingly, to me, I don't know, just kind of seemed devoid of all of that. And I think that's especially aggravated, and not by the church's doing, by the COVID-19 pandemic, where people weren't able to meet together, and people for a long time stayed away from church. I know I've got family active in the LDS Church, and they were really concerned that people, even after COVID-19 was keeping people at home, when people were able to meet in church again, they chose not to come back. So I don't know. It just seems like a lonelier, emptier world than that branch that I grew up with. And it does seem, from my perspective, more corporate. So then there's Coffee for a Dream, and here's this new member's enthusiasm saying, yeah, it runs like a business really well, and that's great. I'm not going to gainsay that perspective. I think, what can I say about that? That's a valid perspective. If that attracts her to the church and affirms her faith, then I'm sure there are other people out there who will feel similarly about it. And, those are the kind of people who will be happy with how well the church seems to function as a business. And one thing that she brought up in her discussion of this was that she liked how the church as a business had meaningful goals. And so again, she's got this positive spin on what it means for the church to be like a corporation, whereas other businesses are only interested in making money. She sees that the church has loftier goals, a bigger vision, a Christian mission that it's involved in. And so it's kind of cool, I think, to be confronted with this new perspective. I have had similar thoughts like that, but for me, it came up in the criticisms that people often make of leaders of the LDS Church. Disillusioned members or ex-Mormons are usually very harsh on leaders of the church, of the LDS Church. And I completely understand where that's coming from, because members of the church, when they're fully active and happy and really, truly engaged and enthusiastic about the church, they tend to idolize these leaders and think the world of them, and think, they possibly couldn't do wrong, that they're almost perfect, and that their lives are filled with miracles every day, and that they speak for God, and, they practically walk on water. And I think so. I think a lot of LDS people do have a kind of unrealistic set of expectations regarding church leaders. And again, the corporation question comes in, because a lot of the leaders of the church are drawn from professions, drawn from boardrooms. A number of them have been chief executive officers, or, in the world of finance. And so there is a kind of, I would say, almost inevitable classism that kind of creeps in, because the people who end up being higher level leaders of the church often come from successful business and professional backgrounds, whereas the people on the local level, not so much, right? And so to rise in the ranks of leadership, you really have to, I think, often be from this kind of background. Now, well, why is that happening? And I think the fairest reading of that is because, people of wealth have time and resources to give. They have something to sacrifice, whereas the average person is not going to be able to spare all that time and all of that money to dedicate their lives to the church. You might say, oh, well, why doesn't the church just underwrite or support the poorer leaders among them? And, there are leaders who are less wealthy. It's not like it's a written requirement that all the leaders have to be wealthy. It's just a tendency. But I also think that it's important to remember, and this is related to a criticism that people have of the LDS Church, that, the church doesn't really want to spend its money. I mean, it has to spend a lot of money. It does, but it avoids doing it. And it, even in its efforts to help the poor, it tries not to spend money doing it. The church rather tries to get its members to make donations. It's not really the case that they're going to want to pay to allow people to become stake presidents, which is like, almost like the head of a diocese region, if you were to kind of put it in Catholic terms. Those people in leadership positions are given a fairly good living, and that makes some disillusioned members or ex-members unhappy, because they're thinking about, the people who pay tithing, they're sacrificing to contribute, and how that might go to, pay for a Mormon leader's salary. But, really, in my perspective, clearly a lot of these guys are they are sacrificing in giving their time to serve in the church, because they might have done something more lucrative elsewhere, but they really valued the spiritual service that they would be giving, so they're taking a pay cut. They're donating all their time. They're really devoting their entire lives to the service of the LDS Church. So it's not like, these guys are sunning themselves on a beach somewhere on a tropical island, laughing as they, throw the widow's mite on a huge pile of coins that they like looking at, or anything silly like that. The leaders of the LDS Church work very, very hard. There's a lot of grueling travel. They're given a lot of responsibilities. And, it's not like they're paid $1 million a year to do it. It's probably more like a low six-figure salary. All right, so probably I would say, I would guess that an upper middle class American family, many of them will make more than a lot of these general authorities are actually making in their jobs. So, that's a thought that I have that's probably closer to the kind of thought that Barbara at Coffee for a Dream would have when, if you put this in the context of corporate America and you think about the fact that the church does legitimately have a spiritual mission. Anyway, I don't know what you think about that. I'd really like to know. There are a wide variety of opinions. Go check out the episode of Coffee for a Dream where this question is raised. You're going to be, I hope like me, you'll find it interesting and curious and refreshing to get this new perspective from a recent convert about what it means for the church to be a corporation and how that could actually be a good thing in light of the fact that it's a corporation that's geared toward performing this spiritual mission of service. All right, well, that's Coffee with Kitch. It's great to see you again. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.